prairie grass, and so we farmed up to that area, and then it was open. And they had fences on both sides there, about, I suppose, I don't know, 100 feet wide, you know, for the highway in case of whatever one built there. So anyway, the gypsies used to go through there.
Oh, really?
You ever hear of gypsies?
Uh-huh.
Anyway, they had a covered wagon that they traveled, their family traveled with in there. And they always were trading horses. There were no tractors in those days. And they always had a string of horses, some good and some not so good. And they were a little bit sticky-fingered, too. You had to be careful of people that lived in the area around there that at night they might lose a few chickens, you know, or something like that. And my dad said the only thing he ever lost there was a big horse collar. They came down one night there, and probably after midnight, and looking around for something they could pick up, and they could trade, you know. And it was a 22-inch horse collar. So they took that one. And they'd send two little children down for eggs and butter and stuff like that, and milk. They had a little brass plaque that said that they would like to have some eggs and milk. So mother would get them some stuff then to take back. About, it was less than a half mile to where they camped from our house. And one night, well, those days, farmers would always go to town on Saturday night and do their shopping. And so there were about 3 grocery stores in town there on the main street.
3?
And one night, all of a sudden, there was a big commotion, and everybody was running for their cars, and they said, "What's going on?" Oh, they said the gypsies are in town. They came in, and when they go into a store, you know, a whole bunch of them would go in there, and they just help themselves and walk out. And so the storekeepers would chase everybody out and lock the door as soon as they could. And yeah, that was a little excitement then.
How often would these gypsies come?
How often would they come by?
Yeah.
Oh, probably. They drifted through the country, you know. They'd camp maybe for a week, and then they'd move on to another place. They had their places all set out ahead.
Would you ever see the same people come again the next year?
No, you never saw much of them. They stayed pretty much. They worked at night. They were night people.
Yeah. How many would you say there were?
Oh, I suppose there were several families there lived in the big covered wagon, you know. Maybe 2 or 3 families and their children. There would probably be a dozen people, at least, in the group. And then they always had a string of horses, and it was kind of a nice setup for them because there was about over 100 feet of nice grassland there, and they could graze their horses, and they'd tie a rope across each end, and then they could graze the area in between. And then they'd you know, I never saw one of the older people. Never saw a mature one up close. Little ones would come, but that's all. Yeah. Well, that was in the 1915, 20, in the 20s.
When did you start working?
Working?
Yeah.
As soon as I could stand up.
Okay. And so what did you do? What were your chores?
Oh, yeah, I always had chores to do, always. And if we'd run out of work to do, we'd go always out in the garden and hoe and pull weeds. And of course, we had the cattle to take care of, herd and stuff like that. Had a couple of pastures, separate pastures.
How many cattle did your dad have?
Oh, they usually around 60 or 70 head, about 75 maybe. Yeah.
And who would he sell them to?
Huh?
Who would he sell the cattle to? when you'd have a sale?
Well, they raised purebred cattle, and they usually were selling bulls. And the bulls would they would be probably a year old. They're big enough to use for service for the little farms. There were probably no more than 2 2/4, which would be 320 acres, and or maybe 4 3/4 would be. So they would have to farm with horses. Of course, we couldn't farm much more than that with one man, you know, farming horses. So they always had a few head of cattle in, and they'd milk a few cows and sell cream and butter and sell eggs. That was their income. They didn't work for wages anymore. They just worked for tried to keep meat or food on the table. No, it didn't make much money. They would sometimes raise some hogs, and that'd be a cash crop. Have to pay the taxes and stuff like that. And didn't buy very many new clothes. Buy a shirt for $1, shoes for $2.
A lot of mending going on, probably. Mending of clothes and whatnot?
What kind?
Oh, well, fixing things, like clothes and things, rather than buying new.
Well, the overalls would wear out on the knees sometimes. They have to patch them, and so they had needle and thread.
Yeah.
Well, finally, in the mid-30s there, the farmers got to buying tractors, and they could farm more land, and so gradually the farms got bigger, and the little farms they disappeared.
Yeah, it got swallowed up.
And it's still going on that way.
Yeah.
I know when I bought my first combine in about 1949, I think, and then I changed work with a neighbor. He hauled the grain, and I run the combine, and we were able to, I think, a combine about 300 acres, something like that.
And what were you growing?
Huh?
What did you grow at that time?
Oh, mostly it was some wheat, oats and barley, and then corn, of course. But we used to pick the corn by hand, you know, put it in a corn crib to dry, and then shell it in the wintertime. Now they just take their self-propelled combines out there and just go through the field like that. And yeah.
So could you, when the Dust Bowl came through, did that affect the farm at all?
Quite a bit.
Okay.
That and the Depression for about 10 years.
What was life like during that time?
Terrible.
You couldn't sell anything? You just had to... Well, I mean, what did you do on the farm?
Well, we tried to raise enough produce from forage, you know, for the cattle, so we could keep the cattle. And had to cut the herd down to about 30 head. And you could raise some Russian thistle. Do you know what a Russian thistle is?
No.
It's a great big bush. They get about that big, and it has a taproot that goes right down, and it takes all the moisture out of the ground. The crops can't survive. It takes it all. But they're like a thistle, and they're like a bush, really, and thorny. But before they get thorns get hard, why the cattle can nibble on them a little bit without getting too many thistles in their mouth. And then some of the farmers would mow the things and stack them up and use it for, try to feed them in the wintertime. Some of the
So those would nothing else would grow, or?
Well, it'd smother everything. The thistles they took all the moisture and covered the ground.
Okay.
So
no grass would grow.
The crown of the crops, of course, their roots were shallow, you know, and the old Russian thistle would go right on by there and pick up all of our sure.
So the thistles just took